What's going on, my good people? Mike Hidalgo here. Thank you for joining us on another FCP Euro DIY. Today, we're going to be working on a 2008 Audi TT Mk2. We're going to be covering how to replace your rear shocks. Now, it is worth noting that this is a front-wheel drive model. In front of me, we have a Bilstein shock with some new bump stops and bellows, as well as a new shock mount and shock mount bolts. The bolts are torque to yield, so you always want to replace them whenever you want to remove them. And by getting all these components in one, we can just assemble new shocks versus worrying about disassembling old units and reusing some old parts. In front of me, we have one of the shocks that came out of this TT. It's a 122,000 mile vehicle, and as you can see, there's not much left that you'd want to reuse. Over time, as these shocks wear out, they stop losing their rebound, and then at some point they're just going to bottom out on their bump stops. So if you have a harsh ride coming from the back of your vehicle, or it's getting really bouncy, more than likely you're just riding on the springs. And if you feel it crashing a lot, then that means you're probably crashing on these bump stops. These are deteriorated, they're pretty far gone, so we're not going to reuse them. We're going to show you how to disassemble and assemble your shocks should you need to replace or use some of those old parts. Now, before we get started on that, let's take a look at some of the tools we're going to need for this DIY. For this DIY, you're going to need your basic ratchets and torque wrenches. We have both 3/8 drive and 1/2 inch drive for both of those. We're going to be using a 21mm wrench. We have a long extension with a 16mm socket and a 17mm socket to get our lug bolts off. Impacts make the big hardware a lot easier to get off. Most importantly needed for this job is going to be a pass-through socket set. I recommend this whenever you're doing any suspension work. This is CTA 7466 specifically. Now, one thing to note is if you do not have a pass-through socket set, oftentimes, depending on the car, you can use a wrench and some sort of counterhole tool. May it be vice grips or pliers, or maybe it's a Torx or hex head. Now, on this model specifically, the top of the shock mount sits flush with the top of the shock shaft itself, so it's going to be a bit hard to get a wrench in there. So just keep that in mind before you tackle this job. You may be able to zap it off with an impact, but oftentimes the shaft ends up spinning. So just a few things to consider there. For those of you following along on a lift, I'm going to recommend a screw jack, and for those of you working at home on the garage floor or the driveway, a free floor jack is going to be needed so you can hold the lower control arm and spring in place when you remove your shock assembly. We'll show you how to do that in just a moment. Now we know what tools we're working with though, let's go ahead and get started on this DIY. All right, my good people, before we head over to the TT and rip out the old shock, I'm going to prepare the new one for install so we can just swap them over. The only thing we're going to be reusing from the old shock assembly is a dust cap, which we'll pull off when we pull the old one out. But if you're looking to learn how to disassemble your shock assembly or assemble, just follow the reverse or the forward of what we're about to do. We have our new bump stop. As you saw in the other unit that we pulled out, it was completely crumbled, so we are replacing them. We have a new bellow as well. These you could reuse, however, we're not going to be disassembling anything, so we're just going to put some fresh parts in it. There is a first ridge on the bump stop here that is going to key into your bellow. That's going to keep everything in place, so this isn't dancing around separate from this. To install them or mate them together, simply push them on top of each other, just like that. And then that's good to go. We're going to slide this over our shock body. Of course, we remove the locking nut first. Tight fit for the bellow, but that's good. That means it won't be dancing around on us. From here, we're going to install our shock mount. Now, I know these look all solid metal, but they do have a rubber bushing inside of them that goes bad over time, which can cause clunking. So while it may look like just a slab of metal, we definitely recommend replacing it, as they do have some wear items inside of them. With that placed over, now we can grab our locking nut, get that started by hand. And as you can see, this is just me starting it by hand, and the top of the nut is almost flush with the top of the shock mount, which is going to make it hard to tighten down if you're not using a pass-through socket set, but I just wanted to show you what that looked like before you get into it. Now we have this hand started, we're going to grab our 17mm socket from our pass-through set and our counterhole tool, and we're just going to snug them down. The torque spec for this nut is 25 Newton meters. Because it's such a small amount, we're just going to hand tighten it today. But if you're following along and you want to torque it down, 25 Newton meters is your goal. That is definitely more than tight enough using the old calibrated wrist. Now we can set these two to the side. Now we have a shock ready to go in the TT. So again, we're going to use a dust cap off the old one, but otherwise this is ready to install. So let's head over to the Audi and pull the old unit out. All right, my good people, we're gonna be working on the rear passenger side of the TT. However, the steps are gonna be identical for the driver and passenger side. First things first is we're gonna remove our beauty cover from our wheel. Use your favorite pick, flathead screwdriver, trim removal tool, whatever you have, just to pop these off. From there, we have 5 17mm lug bolts to remove. If you don't have an impact gun and you're working at home on the ground, break the lugs free with your breaker bar first before you raise up the vehicle. Then you can go ahead and just remove them by hand afterwards. We're using the impact, so we'll just zap them out first. All right, before we remove any shocks or loosen anything at the bottom, our first thing is just gonna get access to the 2 top shock mount bolts. And for that, I'm gonna go ahead and pull 2 T25 screws out of the wheel well so that we can pull the fender liner down a bit. Now I'm simply gonna just reach, find the lip of the wheel liner and just kind of fold it down in the middle here. Now that we have that out, we have a clear access to the 2 16mm bolts that hold the top of the shock mount. But before we remove those, let's go ahead and get underneath the vehicle. At this point, you're gonna wanna use your floor jack for those of you working at home and your screw jack for those of you working on the lift. The goal here is simply to reach the control arm itself and just match the height of the arm. We're not here to raise it or lower it or anything like that, simply just supporting it. Perfect, snug. Now from there, we're gonna grab our 21mm wrench and remove this lower 21mm bolt so that the bottom of our shock is free from our trailing arm, knuckle, carrier, whatever you want to call it. So 21mm wrench, we'll go ahead and break this free. Now the reason I'm using a wrench is 1, it's got good leverage, but 2, the coil spring sits really close to that bolt, so unless you have some really shallow sockets, for us it's impossible to get a ratchet in there with a socket without bottoming out on the coil spring. You might be able to do some weird array of extensions through the coil spring body itself, but it's really not worth it. Here's our old bolt, and here is our washer. This sits in between the shock body and the knuckle. You're gonna wanna make sure you put that in place as you put it, your bolt through. So bolt, shock, washer, knuckle. Pretty straightforward. These are reusable. If they're a little crusty, just clean up the threads before you reinstall them. Now we have everything supported, we can go ahead and tackle the 2 16mm bolts at the top that hold our shock mount in place. To remove the 2 16s up top, you can use a socket and a long extension and a ratchet. Just for the removal process, I'm gonna zap them out with the impact. We have it, it'll make it nice and easy, but a regular socket set with a ratchet will do. Bam, baby, here's one old, tired, destroyed, original shock. Look at that bump stop, or what's left of it. This is what I'm gonna save. I'm just gonna shake the dirt off camera a little bit, give it a wipe, and then we'll pop it onto our new shock assembly. We have our new shock assembly. We took the dust cap off the old one, just gave it a wipe down. They simply pop over the top, and that's it. Now we're gonna go ahead and feed the shock assembly into the shock tower here. One thing to note, there is an angle to the shock mount. It really just goes with the body of the car, so it's slanted like this for us, so make sure you position it properly. Once it's up there, if it's the wrong way, literally just turn it around, no big deal. Once we have it in position, I'm just holding it with my hand on the bottom here. We can start our new 16mm bolts by hand. All right, I got my 16 on my long extension. Just gonna snug them both up, and then we'll give them the final torque. Now we're gonna grab our torque wrench. We're gonna go ahead and torque these 2 down to 50 Newton meters plus 45 degrees. There's 2. Just gonna make a small paint mark on the bolts so I know once I've clocked 45 roughly. Some torque wrenches have an angle mode. If you do, go ahead and use that now. But think of 90 degrees as a quarter turn. We're gonna do a quarter of a quarter, if you will. Now we have those taken care of. If you want at this point, you can reinstall your fender liner. I'm just gonna go ahead and pop this back up, and we'll install our 2 T25s, and then we'll button up underneath the car. Now we're gonna go ahead and install our 21mm bolt using the screw jack or floor jack to raise or lower the knuckle as we need, so we can make sure that the threads are lined up perfectly. Don't forget to install your washer that sits between the shock body and the knuckle as well. One final thing to note, the torque value for this bolt is 180 Newton meters. Now you're gonna need a really shallow socket and torque wrench in order to get that in there. We don't have either today, so we're just gonna use a 21mm wrench to tighten that down as much as we can. I'm gonna feed the bolt through the shock first. I'm just gonna angle it so I don't hit the coil spring. Then I'm gonna feed my washer through at the same time. You can start the bolt in by hand, then you know your threads are lined up properly. Obviously this took a little bit of up and down to get it, but once you get that, this bolt should go in fairly easy, if not by hand the whole way. All right, I'm pretty happy with how that feels. With everything buttoned up, we can go ahead and reinstall our wheel. We'll start our lug bolts by hand. With our car on the ground, we can go ahead and torque the wheels down. We have the 17 on the torque wrench, set to 90 foot-pounds, 122 Newton meters. Always tighten them down in a star pattern whenever possible. And with that, my good people, that is gonna wrap up this DIY for today. Overall, a really straightforward job on the TT. Definitely a friendly DIY at home job. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments on what we did today, there's a specific job you want to see us do on this Mk2 chassis, leave it in the comment section below. And if you like this DIY and you want to see more like them or perhaps find one for your vehicle, consider subscribing. We make new ones all the time. As always, thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.